We're going to get started, folks. If you want to take a seat and thanks for coming tonight. I'm really happy that we're getting a good audience here in the East Bay. I don't think we've ever done the George Oppen Memorial Lecture in the East Bay before. And we were here last night. Chris Nealon was reading with Stephanie Young. And tonight, Chris is giving the Oppen lecture, and I've asked Brandon Brown to do the introduction. So please welcome Brandon Brown.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to lower my mask to read like a page of text. Just warning. Hi. Whoa. Last night, it's wild. Yeah, last night, hearing Stephanie read, you remarked in the kind of media rest, like, this is wild. And even this is wild. Nice to see you. Okay, now I'll read what's on my paper. Good evening, everyone. And thank you for being here for the Poetry Center's presentation of the 36th Annual George Oppen Memorial Lecture, supported by the George. It is my honor to introduce this year's speaker, Chris Nealon. My job tonight is to hasten you to his remarks, but I will take one moment to reflect on my own excitement for George Oppen and the future. For while I have no idea what Chris is about to say, I have long thought of him as one of the key thinkers of futurity in contemporary poetry. You know how there's something delightful about Johnny Rotten singing, "No future for you"? Is that it's a billion. Concede as our inevitable defeat, or just that. From his 2009 book Plummet, in which one poem begins, "I am not gay, I am from the future." Nealon's poetry has invested the future with not only knowledge, but desire to stretch back into history and administer our concupiscence. In 2014's The Dial, Nealon warps the familiar address to the unknown reader, writing from the fraught and deeply unresolved present tense of Occupy to the future, when those events may remain fraught and unresolved, but will at least be historical. "Reader," he writes, "you know the story of the bloody battles that unfolded after. You know it better than I do, since they haven't happened yet." Have I mentioned that this poetry orients itself towards the future with attitude? The exclamation point after "I am from the future." Yes. In his long poem, The Victorious Ones, which appears in 2020's The Shore, Nealon writes, "And yes, like every other poet with a child, I have dreamed of mine along some empty road in camouflage and tatters, scrambling for potable water in 2046. But you know what? Fuck the zombie apocalypse. I'm going to imagine him with comrades." Chris Nealon is professor of English at Johns Hopkins University. He is author of The Shore, from Wave in 2020, as well as 2 books of literary criticism, Foundlings, Lesbian and Gay Historical Emotion for Stonewall, and The Matter of Capital, Poetry in Crisis in the American Century, as well as 3 earlier books of poetry, The Joyous Age, Plummet, and Heteronomy. He lives in Washington, D.C., and let's welcome him right now.
Thank you very much, Brandon. That was really lovely. I am going to take this off and read 20 pages of text. So it's going to take a little while. It's really wonderful to be here. It's amazing to be here a second night in a row. I very quickly, I don't know about you, Stephanie, I think we talked about this, became fond of this space. It's now always remembered as a space where we maybe started to crawl out of something. So thank you for that. And Steve, thank you for the invitation. It's already been a joy. It was a joy to write this lecture. I hope it will be at least a little bit of a pleasure to listen to. It'll involve a lot of the poetry of George Oppen, so how could it not, at least at a minimum? I also have some just very preliminary remarks, including thank you for having me. It's a great honor in my eyes, and also a bit of a miracle that we all knew we'd stumble out of the pandemic one way or another. I think many of us also felt deep down that we might never see each other again. So I'm especially grateful to be here and to be talking to you about George Oppen and the future. If ours seems generally bleak, I think his was perhaps an open question. Oppen was not a poet of the future, certainly not in our major American sense, the Whitmanian one, but I think he was profoundly interested in what you could call social reproduction, and I think we can learn from that. The word future doesn't appear all that many times in the new collected poems, but I'd like to begin with a telling and very moving usage from this in which, and this will be the first of, I guess, several times, maybe a dozen times, where I move away from the podium and mess around my laptop a little bit. So that's going to happen now. Eros. And you too, old man, so we have heard once. An old man's head, bulging and worn, almost into death. The head grows from within and is eroded. Yet they come here too, the old, among the visitors, suffering the rain here above Paris, to the plaque of the 10,000 last men of the commune shot at that wall. In the cemetery of Père Lachaise, in the grave of Largo Caballero, and the monuments to the resistance, a devoutness toward the future, recorded in this city which taught my generation art and the great paved places of the cities, maze and wealth of heavy ancestry, and the foreign rooms of structures closed by their roofs and complete, a culture mined from the ground. As though the powerful gift of their presence and the great squares void of their dead were the human tongue that will speak. If you spend some time reading Oppen chronologically, as I did in the months leading up to my talk, you'll see that this poem is a delicate weave of motifs that Oppen begins developing in the materials and commits himself to, at least through of being numerous. First, the poem begins with a snippet of something that matters immensely to Oppen across his career, dialogue. And in this case, the dialogue hints at another idea that I think is crucial for Oppen and will be at the center of my talk, the intermingling of the old and the young, the intermingling of the old and the new. In Eros, this takes the form of young people telling an old man that they've heard that he too was once part of a militant movement. I think that's very strongly the connotative context for those opening lines. But the commingling isn't just meant to signal intergenerational concourse. It is also a small figure for the blending of the momentary and the perpetual, as when, in Of Being Numerous, he writes about the flow of New Yorkers through the city. For the people of that flow are new, the old new to age, as the young to youth. These are the first lines of Oppen's that ever stuck with me. I was 19 or 20 when I read them, and they seemed like they carried a promise that there might still be surprises in store in a future that was different than the individual future you imagine when you're young. More than that, though, is the way this simple observation undoes or refuses our most instinctive response to time, which is exactly to narrate it to ourselves as a matter of the individual, linearly. Refusing this instinct is a touchstone for Oppen, And it makes a direct link, of course, to his more famous meditations on numerousness and the shipwreck of the singular. The idea forms the immediate background of Eros. In the penultimate section of the poem just before it, the better known A Language of New York, Oppen writes, "Strange that the youngest people I know live in the most ancient buildings." You may know as well that those lines are themselves repeated almost verbatim 3 years later in Of Being Numerous. So Eros reworks and previews not only Oppen's love of shared speech and his insistence that once we think in terms of collective life, past and future look different. They are also catchments for both repetition and a kind of conditioned newness. They entangle perpetuity and instance. Elsewhere in this, in which Oppen will extend this trope to a certain kind of worked material. I didn't put it on a slide, but the poem Carpenter's Boat, a very rare, like vocative poem in Oppen. That poem begins, like the small watercraft that populate all of his books, wood is always given a positive charge in Oppen. In his symbolic system, it's the opposite of glass, which, with the key exception of the figure of the window in a home, almost always carries the connotation of spectacle. Department store glass, office building glass. Wood is also the opposite of stone, and that's the other thing we can see being touched on in Eros. A light equation between the production of space and the material out of which it's produced. Stone boulevards, wood boats. Here, that means the stone that went into making Second Empire Paris, Haussmann's Paris, the Paris of boulevards, the Paris bent on raising the neighborhoods and the lifeways of its proletariat, the Paris that sparked and destroyed the Commune. In Eros, Oppen is watching people, young and old alike, inconvenience themselves to visit Père Lachaise in the rain, specifically to visit the memorial of the 167 militants shot down there in the final battle for the Commune's existence. Oppen asks us not to see this as devotion to the past, as you might expect, but devoutness toward the future. That is, he sees these people seeing the memorial not as a closed-off example of militancy to be worshipped by latter-day leftists, but as a reminder of extant possibilities. Oppen's typically minimal syntax makes it a bit hard to follow at first, but the central pivot of the poem is his saying that Paris, specifically the Paris of the 1920s and 30s, taught his generation two contradictory things: art and the great paved places of the cities. Haussmannized Paris, monumental and inhuman, with its great squares void of their dead, is figured as a culture mined from the ground, accumulating into heavy ancestry and buildings that are closed and complete, that is, shut off from organic life, from flow. That metaphor, and yes, it's a metaphor, Oppen's poetry is built from the ground up with them, though he seems to think otherwise. That metaphor of ancestry as weight is a deliberate restriking of the note struck by Marx when he described this same moment in French history in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, that famous sentence rendered in English as, the tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Poised against this weight in the middle of Eros is art, which is figured as a kind of alchemy by which the humility of pilgrimage becomes a powerful gift of collective presence that, in turn, transforms the great squares void of their dead into the human tongue that will speak. An alchemy, in other words, that takes all the past and present tense verbs the poem's been made up of until now and transforms them into a single, simple future tense, made electrifying. At least I always think so, precisely by the poem's withholding of any verbal futurity until its final gesture. It doesn't have the exuberance of Marx's hopeful exclamation in the 18th Brumaire, "Well burrowed, old mole," where the revolutionary impulse is figured as the creature that does burrow deep beneath dominant historical forces until it can emerge when the moment is right. The prospects for communism in Oppen's day had proved too brutally dim. But you could say that closing figure of the human tongue that will speak opens a kind of window onto possible futures. It might be even better to say that devoutness to the future invites us to look at history in terms of windows. Indeed, the opening poems of Oppen's first 4 books, the first poem in each of those 4 volumes, all contain the word window. I'm not going to put that on 4 slides. I was running out of time. That is a fact made all the more remarkable, of course, by the almost 30-year gap between Discrete Series in 1934 and the Materials in 1962. It's more than just remarkable in its consistency, though. I think there's something about the word. I think the O sound in window forms something like the sonic center of Oppen's sense of social substance. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to do for a while. I'm not sure of the visual conditions, but most of the slides that remain, there's about a dozen of them, have me coding or coloring or highlighting certain vowel combinations. It is an amazing thing to be able to do. I'm going to talk about why I think it's so. I'm not sure how it plays out in terms of slides that you can look at. I meant to make it a kind of like ready reference for you to see what I'm talking about. It can be a kind of a rabbit hole, so I'm going to try to like split the difference between asking you to pay attention between very interesting movements of vowel sounds in the poems, and then actually also keep telling you stuff. So let's see how it goes. So this is the untitled first poem of Discrete Series. The knowledge, not of sorrow, you were saying, but of boredom is, aside from reading, speaking, smoking, of what Maud Blessing-born it was, wished to know when, having risen, approached the window as if to see what was really going on, and saw rain falling in the distance. More slowly, the road clear from her past the window, glass of the world, weather swept, with which one shares the century. That is a lot of O sounds for one little sonnet. O is not the most frequently used vowel sound in English. It's not even the second. It's an unusual thing. I've factored out the short U kind of schwa-like sound of here, but I'm going to have more to say about the sound of the word of, so I did color that word in this particular poem, which does double duty as a technically O-sounding word, but also as a kind of negative space because of its schwa-like character. I'll say a little bit more about that down the line. I'm factoring out that. I'm factoring out the way, just for the moment, of and one have a sound continuity or consonant. And I'm also factoring out for the moment the way the poem could be read as a flowering, a terminal flowering of W sounds, as if the W in window peels off from the world and inspires a light spray of whats and wishes that culminate in the exceptional fruiting or pollination of W's in that phrase, world weather swept with which. Reading Oppen this past summer, I became interested in what I think of as the gaming around a central sound. Let's say here it's the OW in window, so that other sounds around it feel like changes rung on it and make, in toto, if for toto we mean a given poem, something like a preconscious pattern or splatter with its own aesthetic integrity, just beneath what you might call form. Ow, or, OA. They and their cousins here and elsewhere, as we'll see, make up something like a middle C, against which you can measure, whether or not you know you're doing it, a poem's integrity, viscosity, variability, even something sometimes like a sotto voce or prehensile version of the poem's political imagination. This is a poem I got the wonderful chance to read, a compilation put together by Michael Cross and handed to me in PDF form by Steve of many of the Oppen lectures over the last couple decades. They're such an incredible thing to be able to read together, super inspiring. And this, oddly, turns out to be a very discussed poem in many of those lectures. So take this one. which games on short O and long I sounds, establishing them as paired sonic opposites linked by the letter V, so that above and remove are conjoined with wives and private in a struggle over the meanings of social reproduction. This poem's lament over the becoming commercial of food production. You used to crack eggs. There was something slightly sexual about it and personal about it and human about it. And now it's antiseptic and mass-produced. That's the central idea, I think, of this poem, is to lament that. That lament is a miniature and a preview of what I think turns out to be Oppen's great framework for puzzling this question of social reproduction and its relationship to commodity production, the production of people and the production of things. In that framework, women are lined up with the organic, the natural, and the domestic, and men are tragically aligned with machines and with metal. Oppen returns to this opposition again and again across his career. It is a hoary gender distinction, of course, and probably one of the reasons that Kevin Killian, in his astounding 1995 Oppen Memorial Lecture, remarks that as of that date, and I really think still to this day, Oppen's poetry has not received much queer attention. But there is a third term intervening in this distinction, always. Indeed, it is generally the occasion for making the distinction in the first place, and that's capitalism. In the case of this brief little poem, the final two-word line, big business, is very deliberately built to sound enclosed and isolated by its short I sounds, rhyming with Frigidaire and itself, to create a tear or a gully in the poem that makes any easy passage between long I's and short O's impossible. Anytime you think the blessed privacy of wives will offer refuge from the bitter cold of capital, capital turns out to be hovering above it. The giving of the last word and final sound to big business operates as rhetoric and even as metaphor if you're willing to be capacious in your sense of metaphor. The endings of short poems tend to have a higher symbolic weight than their middles, or more particularly, they garner that weight by virtue of those bodies. In either case, it becomes clear that the short I's here are meant to shellac the organic play the poem wishes would break free of its constrictions. Whoops. Indeed, you could usefully compare how Oppen's sonic sense of an ending works here to how it works in Eros, where the human tongue, bursting forth into the future despite the crushing weight of history, does so not only because of its verb tense, but because the speak in will speak is a bravura revaluation of the sound of the EA digraph in terms of how it's used elsewhere in the poem. It has been kept elsewhere short on purpose, so that the final long vowel sound of speak will ring out in open air. Herd, head, death, head, great, wealth, great, speak. The term up for transvaluation here, the term that serves as the opposite to speak, is great, which sounds neither like death nor speak, but which is an epithet for capital, great squares, elsewhere great wealth, and the sham greatness of capital. Oppen is one of those interesting poets who uses great almost only ever in a negative sense. When the word great comes up in a poem, it means something bad. The sham greatness of capital is what is swept away at last by human speech, which you might say, at the end of the poem, takes back the EA digraph for the people. This would all be a stretch, of course, or simply silly, if a theme of social reproduction wasn't so thoroughly and continuously at work in Oppen's poetry, a theme, that is, of how newness comes into the world, even as the powers of the world keep insisting on it remaining the same. Instead of being silly, I think, the sound play and the thematics give each other power, like rhythm and melody and lyrics. It is what keeps the poems from falling into the kind of didacticism everyone likes to critique, and on the side of the didactic poetry that I, at least, always feel nourished by, the didacticism of poets performing for us their acts of discovery. So let's think about the constellation of tropes and terms and sounds that give the theme of reproduction its heft. For starters, we could flash back to Eclogue, the first poem in the materials, where there is, in fact, a window. Eclogue. The men talking near the room's center. They have said, more than they intended, more than they had intended. Pinpointing in the uproar of the living room, an assault on the quiet continent, beyond the window, flesh and rock and hunger, loose in the night sky, hardened into soil, tilting of itself to the sun once more, small vegetative leaves and stems taking place outside. Oh, small ones, to be born. The men discoursing at the center of the room, who have said more than they intended, have formed part of a general human din that marks an assault on the quiet continent. I'm not quite sure what pinpointing is meant to signal, but we'll leave that aside for now. The poem's focus then shifts away from those men, from the party, the noise, to the movement of the soil of that continent. In its scalar shift, reversing the order of the zooming in from continent down to character in the opening pages of the Grapes of Wrath, for instance, and asks us to notice deep diurnal rhythms that culminate in the touch of the sun. This instigates the springing up of plant life, whose low-to-the-ground combination of delicacy and obduracy produces the first flowering of an important Oppen word, small. Small things, small words, everyday acts. Readers of Oppen know that they are crucial to his sense of what's worth rescuing in the present. They promise a life free, small things of overbearing machinery, loose talk, and sealed enclosure. And this first use of small in a poem that's been ringing changes on O sounds throughout, especially OR sounds and their cousins like more and soil and pinpoint, that word small is garlanded with O sounds, climaxing with the one that crystallizes the idea behind the game, outside O small ones, to be born. Each of those uses of the vowel also happens to carry, because of the word that it expressed in, a kind of allegorical weight. Outside, oh, one, born. I'm going to skip over the word two for a second. Unenclosure, outside. The vocative, oh, the singular, the plural, the ones. The infinitive, I didn't skip over two, sorry. Birth. It's an acorn's worth of pure potential. The only thing that's missing from this condensate is Oppen's culminating theme of numerousness, but it points there. Across the poems of the materials, Oppen interweaves figures of heft and density and birth and recursive part-whole relationships to build a picture of what he thinks society-level reproduction consists in. These pictures take form in charged figures of wood, prized for its organic character, of stone, looked at suspiciously because it represents the weight of the past, of rock, the unworked alien material that represents that famous shipwreck of the singular, the obdurate otherness on which all selfhood runs aground. These figures are themselves overlaid with a spatial dynamic that either opposes the country and the city, or the city and the suburbs, gendering them and implicating them each in each other. So the volume's recipe for thinking about reproduction, its concept, you could say, is a mix of figures of material and ideas of the social. It is capable of suffusing a range of poetic gestures and a spectrum of tones. In the poem From Disaster, no slide, which I would call a miniature elegy in the German sense, in German the elegy is a kind of civilization and its discontents genre. In that poem, Oppen tracks the course of immigration to American cities, following, quote, whole families who crawled to tenements across generations and who survive by a morality of hope that for the sons of such families who become blue-collar breadwinners, that hope, quote, ends its metaphysic in small lawns of home. This irony of immigration, work like hell to escape the slums and win your freedom in a little lawn. This irony is made more explicit in Myself I Sing, whose swipe at Whitman and the Whitmanian sense of manifest destiny is condensed into a single line. Pioneers, but trailer people? Two other poems stage this ironic dynamic as a matter of the heterosexual division of labor that Oppen thinks undergirds working class experience in industrial capitalism. The irony is replaced once sexuality is brought into the mix by a combination of lament and veiled hope. Lament that men are chained to machines and money, while women are left to represent and foster organic life in shabby domestic interiors, and hope that something in the recursive movement of social reproduction might somehow, at some turn, point past what looks at any given moment like enclosure. In The Undertaking in New Jersey, this recursivity is given the figure of birdsong. And here's a place where, I'm asking you to listen to what I'm saying about a thematic, a movement of birds, but I also want you to hear a certain sound, which is why I colored these digraphs and sounds. So there's various UR and IR sounds: girls, surely, nourished, return, curbs. I put born in green because it's such a talismanic word. I wanted you to notice its presence in the poem. And then long eyes in contrast with short eyes. I think this poem games with the difference between it and I and is doing something with that. At the very last line of the poem, carry quickly into daylight the excited birds. Some of those colorings I gave you are doing double duty, and I'll explain what I mean in a little bit. The sound of a bird's voice in city streets may not mean much, the poem suggests, but it draws attention to a complex human dynamic. It chirps at curbs and curb gratings, at barbershops and townsmen born of girls. Of girls. Girls gave birth. But the interiors are the women's curtained, lit, the fabric to which the men returned. This gendered loop is nested inside a lyric one, in which the not especially meaningful sound of birdsong from the beginning of the poem, which was the poem's occasion, returns as the frame for a fantasy of something better than that meaninglessness, emerging from the degraded landscape that is marked as former farmland become highway and cheap housing. Surely they imagine some task beyond the window glass and the fabrics, as if an eventual brother in the fields were nourished by all this in country, torn by the trucks where towns and the flat boards of homes visibly move at sunrise, and the trees carry quickly into daylight the excited birds. So you could say that there's an ancient poetic trope there, the poet and the bird, right? Certainly Whitman works on. And sometimes, of course, the bird, very frequently in the English language tradition, is imagined as being able to sing the song of freedom that the entrapped poet who has a complex psyche could never sing with the freedom with which a bird sings. Sometimes, as in this case, birdsong, after the 20th century begins to seem just like one other kind of animal sound. But its meaninglessness is transmogrified by adding a certain kind of context of what birds do, which is that they can leap out into the air. So if their song by itself is meaningless, perhaps their song being made by creatures who also are capable of exciting forms of movement suggests the possibility that if we reframed it, there might be meaning where we didn't expect. I admire the complex hedging of bets in that last figure, by which the morning rush of highway traffic produces both a shudder in the cheaply built homes and a tremor in the trees, releasing the birds into air. Who knows what they might be singing? That complicatedly chastened lyricism shapes the poem Antique as well, 10 pages later. That poem yokes together the immigrant labor of men who brought New York City's infrastructure into being and the domestic interiors of the city's outer rings. Again, some highlighting of sound patterning for you. Continents of workmen, where we built Grand Central's hollow masonry, veined in bolted rails, in shabby city limits, and the backyard homes, in which some show of flowers and of kitchen water holds survival's thin, thin radiance. As in the closing big business of the soda jerking poem, the short eyes of that thin, thin shut down or enclose the play of O's that promise to link the work of men and the domesticity of women. That is to say, that the activities characterized in the poems as separated by gender nonetheless get similar vowel sounds, and so there's a kind of sub-rosa way in which we're being asked to imagine the conditions, sonic conditions being an analogy for potential social conditions under which they wouldn't have to serve as opposites to each other in the way they do at the verbal stratum of the poem. The difference here from the big business soda drinking poem is that the short A's of shabby and backyards and kitchen water are minimally transvalued at the end of the poem into the long A of radiance. So kind of like the way that speak transvalues a vowel sign that's been withheld from us, or that the future tense, by being the only one that sort of steps out from a rigorously unfutured environment of verbs in the other poems I've been talking about, we experience them as shifting in value. Here, radiance leaps out from all the short A's. I'm going to, I guess I just did, I'm going to pause here. Since this whole thing is the crux of what I'd like to convey, I think that the matter of the future in Oppen is expressed through this sound play, specifically organized around how different consonantal environments alter vowel sounds. I think this sound play is meant to give us an experience of value and transvaluation, as Oppen gives us the same sound, say, in words with both different and similar value connotations, as in how radiance leaps away from shabby, but also supplants the long A of masonry. That is to say, there is another long A word with a very specifically negative connotation for Oppen if you read across his work. Stone stuff, built stuff, city stuff, bad. Readers habituated to Oppen will recognize masonry as a word signaling that deadening weight. Indeed, of a certain kind of meaninglessness, even without the epithet hollow. I think the local weather of such games with sound and connotation is something that, of course, you can find in many poets, especially with those who have the good luck to have long careers or build us data sets. The playing with the values of sounds we find in Oppen could, of course, be brought to bear on other kinds of subject matter in other poets, and it would, in those cases, be liable to other kinds of interpretation about other great and preoccupying themes. There is nothing innately to do with the question of social reproduction in a poet's attempt to create a sense of surprise or newness by working her sound deck. But I do think the dynamic interaction between the vowel preferences and the word hoard in Oppen is coherent enough to say that it operates as something like an allegory. In particular, an allegory of the life-savingly unpredictable aspects of social reproduction. Who'd have known what the word radiance would sound like and imply, having been preceded by the doubling of thinness, but also emerging in clarity out of the matrix of the short A vowel sounds that preceded it. To put the word radiance at the end of your poem as opposed to somebody else's poem is actually going to make it sound and feel different. I think this work of sound and meaning in Oppen is both very beautiful and quite intellectually compelling, although it is a bit of a rabbit hole. Once you start saying this, it's hard to get back out of it. And I think it goes some way toward compensating for what Peter Quartermain in his Oppen lecture identified as the slightly puritanical and grim insistence in Oppen on a so rigidly reduced vocabulary, no slang, very little chatter, and with the remarkable exceptions to be found in this and which, no exclamation points. But I also think that Oppen's reduced vocabulary does us the favor of training us to see. It's like an infrared or something. It's like an interestingly reduced, simplified or stylized environment. I think it's training us to see and hear something that is present but harder to isolate in poets with wider sonic and discursive or rhetorical ranges. The restriction he always gives us makes it easier for us to see and hear it being worked to interesting and often very moving ends. In Oppen, most often, that end is the end of natality. Sounds sound different depending on the sounds that came before, not only in strict linguistic terms, but in rhetorical ones too. They keep being born. This poetic gaming does not operate over and against the mechanical causality the poems decry, so much as under its radar. I do not think it is any more consciously crafted in Oppen, or at least in any single instance, than a perfect slam dunk or a flawless pirouette would be. But I think he has a general awareness of it as a poetic strategy with potential uses for the political imagination. Oppen overlaps here with Robert Frost when Frost writes to John Freeman, "I ask no machine to tell me the length of a syllable. O may be as long as prolonged agony or as short as a slight surprise." Now, Frost and Oppen were very different kinds of anti-capitalists, but I think it's useful to notice that they share a sense of sound play as a humanness that is to be contrasted to machines, because it's a reminder that overlap or even agreement on matters of technique does not add up to political agreement. This relationship between minimal concord and ideological splay is mirrored, I think, in a similar dynamic around the existentialist currents in which Oppen swam. When he pits fragile, destructible human natality against the crushing weight of mechanical reproduction, especially figured as crushing weight or enclosing wall, he is putting himself in the orbit of an ideologically very wide range of philosophical thinking from the first half of the 20th century that also makes much hay out of our precession by objects. I imagine for many of you, my remark will call to mind Oppen's attraction to ideas in Heidegger, especially the idea of our thrownness into a world already developed and accumulating out ahead of us. But we might also think of Sartre's idea of the practico-inert, which I think was meant, among other things, to recapture Heideggerian thrownness for the left, where it could serve as ground for a collective honesty about the sheer path-dependent course of history that anyone who wants to change it is up against. And we could, of course, since I've been using the word, think of Hannah Arendt's idea of natality, in which the fact that to be for humans is to have been born is specifically linked to the possibility of creative action over and against bureaucracy and deadening labor, though not against capital per se. All of these vocabularies of our precession by the deadening weight of objects, which I'm inclined to call left, right, and centrist, are built around a desire for some kind of authenticity, and specifically around the idea that we have been made untrue to ourselves by a modernity primarily understood as mechanistic and secularizing. These are all anti-capitalist vocabularies, though they are all also anti-dialectical. They all want us to get to a subjectivity beneath the falseness of modernity, anterior to it, more real, rather than thinking about these problems as something that have co-evolved. In this desire to get back to the basics, to clean the slate, these vocabularies and intellectual currents are liable to Adorno's accusation that they are more of a jargon of authenticity that plays into the hands of capital, which speaks the language of individual rebellion all too fluently, as we know in the Bay Area. So when Adorno titles a section of negative dialectics, the object's preponderance, he is already being dialectical. He believes that the thinkers of authenticity, left, right, and center, Heidegger, Sartre, Arendt, he thinks they have identified a real problem, but placed it in the wrong frame. It's not just that the problem is called modernity, and modernity is the meaning of a bunch of stuff always getting there before us. There was already a Paris before I got here. It's boulevarded. There's no cool little nooks and crannies anymore. That's the life I gotta live. He thinks about this a little bit differently, and as he puts it in that section of negative dialectics, to grant precedence to the object means to make distinctions between things, between objects, which in themselves are indirect. So it's not that the stuff is realer than us and we have to deal with that tragedy. Each of those objects only makes meaning in a relation to others. More so, or more than that, what taking this argument seriously, Adorno's, would mean for us as readers of Oppen's poems, I think, is that we'd need to see ourselves on call to conceive of the industrial organization of material life, the million-windowed buildings, the sprawl, the suburbs, not only as a crushing weight or deadening enclosure, but also as a web of ever-incomplete attempts at reproducing itself, attempts at reproducing the conditions of accumulation. And I won't bore you here, but that is a place where, unfortunately, Adorno joins his undialectical compatriots in setting aside a sense of capitalism as a thing that, even though it's always winning, always has to try. Capital has always already won, and that's just kind of the name of the game in Adorno by the end of Adorno's writing life. So Adorno, the object's preponderance. Mysteriously, Oppen puts the phrase, the preponderance of objects, in quotes toward the end of the final poem in the materials, which is called Leviathan. I haven't been able to locate the source, and I trust Stephen Cope when he writes in his Oppen lecture that the poet was very unlikely to have read Adorno, so it's a mystery to me. But the poem's argument overlaps with Adorno's overarching argument in negative dialectics quite a bit. The argument that the truth is in motion, not least the particular truth, the only ever partly actualized truth, that would answer the question, who or what are we? Leviathan. And this is a case where it's important enough for you, in my mind, to think about the kind of political philosophical dynamic that I'm sparing you color coding of vowel sounds. It's just the poem. Truth also is the pursuit of it, like happiness, and it will not stand. Even the verse begins to eat away in the acid. Pursuit, pursuit. The wind moves a little, moving in a circle, very cold. How shall we say? In ordinary discourse, we must talk now. I am no longer sure of the words, the clockwork of the world. What is inexplicable is the preponderance of objects. The sky lights daily with that predominance. Keep thinking of that like all-night lit up billboard on the Bamfa wall. And we have become the present. We must talk now. Fear is fear, but we abandon one another. I take it that the sense in which truth, like happiness, will not stand is that it will not stand still. And this is a danger to poetry, not only because words are always liable under any system of domination to become part of the clockwork of the world, but also because time and change will always alter what counts as ordinary speech, the speech Oppen always felt was least in danger of capture by industrial culture. As a bookend to the first poem in the volume, that poem Eclogue that we looked at, which ends in small things being born just outside the warming circle of human speech, Leviathan closes the materials with a worry that the light of the spectacle bespeaks a dehumanizing power that leaves us too frightened or demoralized, pandemic anyone, even to feel hunger for the best parts of shared talk. The arc of the preponderance of objects bends toward atomization. But both the poet and the philosopher know that it needn't be this way, partly because they sense the power of other kinds of objects than industrial ones, or because they are sensitive to other ways we might experience objectivity in the first place. Famously, for Adorno, this otherness obtains in the most difficult self-negating art. For Oppen, as I've begun to suggest, that otherness obtains in various residual, endangered pastorals of wood, of grass, and especially of small craft seafaring. I have almost run out of time to flesh that out for you, but not quite. To close out my talk, I'd like to look at the final poem of A Being Numerous. So I'm going to skip over that Summa, that amazing poem, which, when you start reading up in a certain way, it really is an astounding amalgamation of so many of these themes and so many of these versions of sound play. But I'm going to skip over that to this one-page poem called Ballad, which on my slide actually is 2 slides, but read it for you here. Astrolabes and lexicons, once in the great houses. A poor lobsterman met by chance on Swan's Island, where he was born. We saw the old farmhouse propped and leaning on its hilltop on that island where the ferry runs. A poor lobsterman. His teeth were bad. He drove us over that island in an old car. A well-spoken man, hardly real as he knew in those rough fields, lobster pots and their gear, smelling of salt. The rocks outlived the classicists. The rocks and the lobstermen's huts, and the sights of the island, the ledges in the rough sea seen from the road, and the harbor and the post office. Difficult to know what one means, to be serious and know what one means. An island has a public quality. His wife in the front seat, in a soft dress such as poor women wear, she took it that we came, I don't know how to say. She said, not for anything we did. She said, mildly, from God. She said, what I like more than anything is to visit other islands. Like Eros, the poem we began with, the particular backward glance of the word once, the tale-telling connotations of it, launches a story of value. Once there were astrolabes and lexicons in the great houses. In Eros, recall, it was the young telling an old man that they'd heard of his generation's militancy, which the poem implies will one day return, not through any messianic inevitability, but because they form part together of the human tongue that will speak. Here, that word once distinguishes the objects of early capitalist elites, the astrolabes and lexicons, from the working class object world and working class language, lobster pots and mild speech and soft dresses and bad teeth, which the poem implies lie closer to the perplexity of humanness than the tools of mastery do, that it's somehow more real. That the rough fields of this main island and the perdurable rocks make the lobsterman aware that he is hardly real, the poem suggests, is a nobler thing than either the acquisitive mastery that led to the so-called age of exploration or the experience of pseudo-reality in the industrial cities, which, like the houses here, are great in that negative sense particular to Oppen. To be hardly real and to know it is to be kept honest, kept modest. If the poet worries that it is difficult to know what one means, given that the rocks confront us with a baffling endurance, given that the objects predominate, there is at least the consolation that there are two kinds of objects that baffle us, those produced by nature and those produced by human domination, and that the first kind of bafflement yields a common speech unlike the meaningless chatter of the spectacle, unlike the clockwork of the world. And that commonness of speech is what links the speech that rises against all odds from the Haussmannized boulevards and squares of paved-over Paris on the one hand, and the tattered hillsides and ramshackle agoras of the little islands on the other. Across his career, Oppen keeps his lexicon restricted in order to navigate and to give us to feel a low-level perpetuity of sonic gaming and transvaluation that, if it doesn't add up to the promise of a future victory over capital per se, insists on seeing birth continually emerge out of recombination. And I think for Oppen, that sonic gaming is, as the title ballad suggests here, the song of the people. In 2021, it's much harder to chart out opposition to capitalist accumulation by dividing the world into good and bad kinds of objects, the natural and the unnatural, or to make persuasive metaphors of capitalist destructiveness out of images of tragically unrealized forms of heterosexual complementarity, husbands chained to machines, wives lonely at home. It's hard to see the humble dignity of impoverished but well-maintained objects of rural life, or the humble speech of impoverished but decently educated people, and imagine them as a counterweight to glass towers and advertising billboards. It's hard to imagine choosing rhetorical austerity as a route to authenticity without admitting that it would run the risk of cutting one off from exactly the vernaculars one wishes to honor, including the American vernaculars, Black speech, most of all, Black inventiveness, that have faced commodity language head-on. Indeed, it's hard to imagine pursuing subtractive authenticity and seriousness without it becoming a purely individual product, despite the whole aim of Oppen's project being organized around being numerous. But those windows, all his volumes open with, those minor openings onto limited prospects, their persistence across so many years is interesting to me. Their placement is interesting to me. More than all his counterposing of the inauthentic and the real, they seem like the closest analogy to the meaning of the gaming with sound values he so clearly loved. Windows give glimpses, which is how we experience both the occasional awareness we have of capital in its wholeness, and our sense of what else there might be. Every now and then, it looks and feels like blinking at the blades of a fan. Each fresh birth of sonic value, flushed out of the bushes only for an instant, and differently each time, is itself a more germane comparison to how capital actually functions. Not by making natural things unnatural per se, that's a whole flank of Marxist complaints about capital for sure, but by producing value and waste, including, of course, human waste, in a widening spiral that is, for all its terrible power, both path-dependent and incapable of reproduction without fresh life and without constant propping up. Those Second Empire buildings, after all, were built on credit. They are, if you see them a certain way, husks as much as monuments, relics of value in motion. I'm always hesitant to make analogies between language and money, and you won't catch me out at parties championing the materiality of the signifier. But the capacious frame of mind in which the two meanings of value, sound value, capitalist value, the frame in which those two meanings are not on separate tracks or in analogy or metaphors for each other, but barely, just barely visible as cousin kinds of human activity. That's the kind of vast frame I think you need the repose of a little window to sense. When the wife at the end of Ballad gorgeously, movingly concludes the poem by saying, "What I like more than anything is to visit other islands." This remark comes after the wife is credited with a wider conception than Oppen had allowed himself of the circumstances of their meeting. He describes it as happening by chance. She says that he and Mary came to her and her lobsterman husband that day from God. Oppen makes it clear that he thinks she's right, in some sense. Her conception is more capacious, more double. People come from God of a day as they come into the world. He clears his throat twice as he tries to convey what she said. "I don't know how to say," she said. "Not for anything we did," she said. Trying to make sure he's going to get her tone right, trying to make clear she didn't mean he and Mary were somehow special. Then he hands it all over to her, with a third she said that takes first rather than final position in the thought. So the she saids come at the end the first times, and then the remainder of the poem is following on the final use of she said. Then she picks up the chiasmus by which he hands her the baton with a long I, short I reversal of her own, like is visit islands, I, mediated, as all his vowel play is mediated, by recessive schwa sounds, the short uhs that create the neutral or the reproductive sonic space in the English language that makes it possible to hear such consonantally framed vowel games in the first place. They are the sounds that frame the phrase, the schwa sounds, of being numerous, after all. And leaving us at last, at the end of the volume, and at the end of the major phase of her career, with that little archipelago of ellipses, dot, 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 island, island, island. Almost too gorgeous once you notice it. And in its scattering beauty, an allegory, I'll conclude by saying, not of how we make it to the future alive, but what it might feel like when we get there. Thanks, everybody. Am I supposed to stay here? I don't know. I'll do as you wish. I think in olden times, I watched a bunch of videos to study up, and in olden times there were questions, but I'm happy to just like... Or I'm happy to go stand out on the sidewalk in fresher air and talk about all this there as well. Yeah?
You mentioned in passing the metaphor of on being numerous. I'd just like if you could speak about that more, because I read the poem for the first time last night, and that caught my attention. I assumed it was at first an invoking of Mallarmé, but it stuck with me more than any of the details in the poem, and I'd like to hear more of your thoughts.
Yeah, my thoughts are in beautiful phrase. I think I don't have a super original way of reading it myself, but I think it's a way of, Oppen's time and place, thinking that, American individuality is the great desideratum. You want to be truly yourself, and it's construed as a separateness from others. Maybe that's partly a settler logic. We might be more equipped to see that these days than we used to be. Having your own place, your own plot, your own stuff. But it's dehumanizing in a certain way because we're social animals, and it is a shipwreck. It leads you nowhere. Those small little suburban lawns that you fought so hard to get, and then you don't see anybody anymore. I think. Yeah, sure. Thank you for asking that. Should we leave this face off and just hang out for a while? Okay, thanks everybody.